Now joined by Rabbi Tzvi Kורן. He's the head of the education department of that organization, Emanei Torah Avodah. Thank you very much for joining us. I understand you're in beautiful Shoresh outside Jerusalem.
That's true. Hello.
So disturbing data there, and this is, as I mentioned, just the cases that are reported, and we always have to remember that when it comes to sexual abuse, because so many people don't speak up, so many numbers don't even arrive at the Ministry of Welfare. According to your estimate, how many cases are not reported? What are real numbers?
So it's very important that we differentiate between the facts or the data that we have and what is our interpretation of it. The numbers are based on how many people have come to the social services and been given service based on this issue of being sexually harassed, and not only harassed, that have been sexually mistreated. And the numbers are, as you said, the numbers are higher in the Haredi schools, and we based it on, the research is based on what school system the children go to, and then the religious school system, the numbers are higher. How many cases are not reported? It's I don't know. I guess that's a thing that's impossible to discern because you don't get the data of how many cases are not reported. What we can say is that there is certainly a rise in the awareness and the willingness of people to complain and to put it out in the open. I think that's a very positive development. If in the past, the religious world, both Haredi and national religious, or the general world as well, was very wary about raising any such issues, talking about it, telling the story that I've been abused and so on, then now there's much more of a willingness to bring it out. And that's one very important factor here.
Now
is this the reason? It's very hard to say why there are the differences between the different groups. And sometimes it can be very speculative. But it's interesting to note that there is a rise in the numbers of cases that are reported and that are being treated. And I think what we can say is that traditionally, sexual issues, sexuality in general, was something that we wouldn't talk about. It's something that was kind of hidden. And when it's hidden, then there are cases of abuse that nobody knows about, and people just continued their lives with the pain, with keeping the secrets. And now there is a rising willingness in the religious school system to address these issues, to talk about them, not only where there is abuse, to create what we call in Hebrew mיניות בריאה, healthy sexuality, a healthy attitude towards sexuality,
and we should
us to put things out in the open and talk about the cases of abuse.
We should welcome that, and of course that's a very good movement and transition. And I also want to ask later on how your organization and this sort of work that you do is perceived and received by those communities. But first of all, let's dive back into the data. And how do you explain the numbers? Because you said there are many variables we don't really know. What can we know? We know, for example, for one thing, that boys and girls are separated. They don't study together. What else do we know? How do we explain the fact that it's more than twice the numbers of cases that are reported in a society that keeps things very private and doesn't tend to go to the authorities?
And it's as I said, it's very speculative. It's very hard to say what the reasons are. It might be true that in places where sexuality is kind of tried to be contained and not allowed, and the sexual expressions are not allowed, the boys and the girls are very often separate, and expressing sexuality is not acceptable. What happens is it goes underground, and then things happen in ways that shouldn't happen. That could be a reason, but it's all very speculative. It's very hard to say. I would try and look at what we can say. What we can say is that, for instance, as like you said, the numbers in the different systems are different. It's very interesting to note another piece of the information that the numbers of girls that report cases of abuse is higher than the number of boys, but the relative number of boys in the religious system is higher than that of boys in the non-religious system. Again, I could be speculative and try to speculate why that is. Maybe in a system where it's mostly men teaching boys, there are more cases of abuse of boys. But again, this is very speculative. It's very, very sensitive, very touchy to say that. I would make another point, and that is that two other points. One is that, of the 2 points of the data, one is that the separate, some schools in the religious system are separate, boys and girls, and sometimes the boys and girls study together in a religious school, and we don't find a very clear difference between the two. So that what we're saying is that we have differences of opinion in the religious society about should the boys and girls be separated in the school system, in the educational system, at what age, and so on. We think that we need to prepare them for adult life in a modern religious world where men and women encounter one another and work together and meet and talk with one another, and so they should be taught how to do that. Other people feel it's important religiously to separate the boys and the girls, and there are different ways of looking at it. But at least in the issue of abuse, we don't see that raising boys and girls separately creates less abuse. I wouldn't say more, but not less. Another indication is that one of the points of information of data is that there are more reports of abuse. Again, I don't know how many facts there are. There are more reports of abuse in smaller, homogeneous settlements, communities, like in regional communities, regional areas, regional schools, where people live in their own very homogeneous communities. This is true also in the non-religious schools and in the general school educational system, and also in the religious educational system. And I can, again, I might be making a speculation, but I can understand that when the society is more close-knit and closed, there will be more cases of abuse. Rather than being protected, people are closer, just like we know that sexual abuse happens often with people that the children are familiar with, within families and so on. The more closed the society is, the more close-knit it is, the more there's protection of the abusers, and there are more cases of complaints later on.
Yeah, that all makes sense, but you're forgetting one factor, I feel, and that is that we're talking about religious people. And I ask, where is religion? Where does it come in to be a good person? I mean, you would have thought, or one could have thought, or I would have thought, that these societies would actually be safer for children than, other secular societies where people, some would say, are lacking values, etc., etc.
So I agree with what you're saying, some would say, and I think one of the points of our research is exactly to make that point. Being religious does not mean that you have protection from any kind of danger of sexual abuse. It doesn't mean that if you don't talk to your children about it, you don't teach them about sexuality, you don't give names for body parts because you don't want to talk about them and so on, that then they're going to be protected from it. It might mean quite the opposite. But that doesn't mean that our conclusion is going to be, okay, let's leave religion. It means that within the frameworks of religious law, of halakha, it is important and necessary to talk about these issues, to talk about them in a religious way, maybe a modest way, but not in a way that keeps things secret.
Of course. And we sadly, on that note, sadly, Rabbi Tzvi Koren, we have to part just because the commercial break is here. But thank you so much for being